Have you ever noticed that life doesn't usually steal all the magic all at once? You know, or like sometimes you just think it slipped away. It happens so slowly that you don't even realize it's happening. One disappointment, one heartbreak, one setback, one responsibility, one bad decision, one unexpected diagnosis, one relationship that falls apart until one day you wake up and all the excitement that you used to have for life is gone. You're no longer wondering what incredible thing tomorrow might bring. You're just trying to survive today. I think that that's happened to every single one of us. Somewhere along the way, life convinces us we've already experienced the best that it's ever going to be or to get. But looking back over 55 years, I've realized something that I wish someone had told me decades ago. The greatest opportunities of my life never arrived looking like opportunities. They arrived disguised as some of the hardest days I've ever lived through. My whole life, I heard people say, when one door closes, another one opens. But I don't think that's quite right. I think, when one door closes, a window opens. The problem is, windows don't look like windows. They look like pain, loss, fear, failure. And by the time they appear, we've usually lost enough of the magic that we don't even recognize them as open windows. I certainly did that. Years ago, I was in a car accident that honestly should have killed me. And a lot of you know that. It was bad enough that the police couldn't believe I survived. And the doctors honestly couldn't believe that I walked away. I broke my back, knocked out my teeth, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. I spent almost 2 years recovering. And if you'd have asked me then what I thought about my future, I'd have told you that my life had changed forever. And I would have been right, just not in the way that I thought. For years, every time I thought about that accident, all I saw was what happened to me. The pain, the recovery, everything that I'd lost because of it. And it took me years to realize that that wasn't really the story. The story wasn't that I broke my back or any of that. The story was actually that I got another chance to live. I'd spent so much time focusing on what happened that I never stopped to appreciate what didn't. I could have died that day, but I didn't. That accident wasn't a blessing. I'd never call it that. But surviving it, that was one of the windows. I just couldn't recognize it, while I was living through it. The strange thing about life is you almost never recognize the windows until years later. And I wish I could tell you that I understood that lesson right then and there, but I didn't. Because life, had closed or had another closed door waiting for me, one that would hurt even more. Years later, I found myself living a life that didn't even feel like mine anymore. And I know a lot of you are living that same life or have. But little by little, I'd stopped being me. If you've never lived through emotional abuse, it's hard to explain. It doesn't happen overnight. It happens one compromise at a time. You stop saying what you're thinking, you stop doing the things that you enjoy, and that's a big one. And you start walking on eggshells trying to avoid conflicts, and you're just trying to keep the peace. Trying to become whoever you think someone else needs you to be until one day you don't recognize yourself anymore. And that was me. I developed anxiety. My blood pressure went through the roof. I ended up with heart problems. I wasn't living, I was surviving. And eventually I realized I had a choice: stay or, and lose myself completely. So, I walked away. I walked away from a beautiful home, everything I'd worked years to build, and most of what I owned. And again, most of you know that too. But I didn't do any of that because it was easy, but because I finally realized peace was worth more than any possessions. But before long, I was living in my truck, and again, you know that too. But let me tell you something. People love stories about starting over. Living them is something completely different. It was lonely, it was uncertain, and it was downright scary. Every day I wondered if I'd made the biggest mistakes of my life. Every night I wondered what tomorrow would even look like. But, here's what I've learned since then. Life doesn't just take your money, it doesn't just take your confidence. If you let it, it starts taking the magic. That belief you had as a kid that tomorrow held surprises, that life still had adventures waiting, that something incredible could still happen. But one disappointment at a time, that feeling starts disappearing until eventually you stop expecting anything good to happen at all. And when you stop expecting it, you stop looking for it. You know, it, and I had reached a point where I honestly believed my story was over. And it wasn't because somebody told me it was, but because I couldn't imagine it being anything else. I had no way of knowing that the lowest point of my life was standing only a few steps away from becoming the biggest turning point of my life. Because there came a night in that pickup truck, that I never talked about publicly before until one of my last videos. You know, but that night that I didn't talk about, I you know, I kept it to myself for a long time because I wasn't sure if I ever should. But after something happened a few days ago, I think maybe it's time. You know, that night I'd reached a place where I honestly couldn't see a future anymore. And not because I wanted to believe that, but because every experience I had up to that point had convinced me life was only going to get harder. You know, I'd lost my home, I was living in a pickup truck. I couldn't see any path forward. And I made a decision, one that would have meant you and I would never be having this conversation. But then something happened. And I've replayed that moment in my mind more times than I can count. And here's the honest truth. I don't know what it was. And I'm not about to stand here and pretend I have an explanation because I don't. I only know what happened to me. Something stopped me. It was the most real moment I've ever experienced in my life. Nothing magically changed. I still woke up in that pickup truck the very next morning, and I still had no idea where my life was headed. And I still had to rebuild my life one day at a time. But something inside me changed in that moment I just talked about. Not everything, but just enough. enough to get through one more day, then one more, then another. And looking back at it, I realized that that was yet another window. Not because life suddenly became easy, but because I stayed alive long enough to discover what was waiting on the other side. A little camper, 10 acres, the elderly woman who owned her finances property to me because she believed in me, you know, and peace I've never experienced before. And then, something else that I never could have imagined. At 55 years old, I picked up a camera. I had no plan. I wasn't trying to become a YouTuber. I just wanted to share what life had taught me. I figured that if only one person heard my story and realized that they weren't alone, it'd be worth it. And a few days ago, someone left me a comment that stopped me in my tracks. They said that my video made them wonder if something was trying to get through to them because it seemed like that video came at a perfect time. Whether you agree with that or not isn't the point. The comment, though, made me stop and think. It made me look back over my own life. And for the first time, I saw the pattern: the accident, the marriage, the pickup truck. Every one of those moments looked like the very end when I was living them, but none of them were. Every one of them became the beginning of something that I just couldn't see yet. Maybe that's why we lose the magic. Because, we think that today's circumstances have already written tomorrow's story, but they haven't. If there's one thing that 55 years has taught me, it's that the worst day of your life is the worst day to decide how the rest of your life is going to turn out. I've been wrong every single time that I thought my story was over. Every single time. So if you're watching this today and life has convinced you that there's nothing left, I'm not going to tell you everything will magically work out, because none of us can make that promise. But I am going to tell you this: don't let today convince you that tomorrow has nothing left to offer. Because the greatest opportunities of my life never arrived looking like opportunities. They arrived disguised as pain, loss, fear, and closed doors. And every single one of them led me to something I never would have found otherwise. And maybe that's why I finally understand that old saying, not because another door opened, but because there was a window. And I finally learned to look for it. This video does nothing else. I hope it helps you hold on to just enough of that magic to take, just one more step. Because sometimes one more step is all that's standing between the life you think is over and the life you never imagined was still waiting for you. Folks, if you got anything out of this video, do me a favor. Click the thumbs up button, please. That's the only way that this message gets to other people. Thank you, and I'll see you in the next one.